but unfortunately we never saw them again. As I said, first of all, young Jewish men and women were taken away, and then Jews that were not useful to the Slovak economy, like small shopkeepers, government employees, professional people, Jewish men that were discharged from the army. But because my father was a farmer, he was considered useful member, useful to the Slovak economy, and therefore we received a document that for the time being we shouldn't be taken away. So this is why we were not taken away in the first phase of deportation from Slovakia. In February 1942, I was sent home, also my brother, we came home. We were still living there for the next 2 years in big fear, because even though the deportation of Jews stopped in October, the arrest of Jews continued. And already at the time, the news were filtering what was happening to these Jews. So it was very frightening, and nobody wanted to be arrested because they were afraid that eventually they will be deported. So we used to play sort of a hide and seek with the Slovak police, which was the Hlinka Guard. And when they were in the neighboring village looking for Jews, our friend would notify us, and we would run to the cornfield where we would hide for the whole day. And when the police came to the village, they found the house locked, and they reported probably to the superior that we were not home. At the time, the population did not cooperate with the Hlinka Guard because, as I said, the Slovak people hated the Slovak regime, the Tiso regime, and therefore we had a lot of friends helping us to avoid arrest. Other time, we would run to some of our employees in the evening, and we would sleep overnight in their houses because there was a raid during the night looking for Jews, and we were informed in advance. And these people were very good. It was very heroic of them to take us in, because if they were found out that they were hiding Jewish people, they would have been very severely punished. Other time we would hide in the barn, in the attic where we were drying the corn. We had a place there, and we had a ladder. We would climb up and pull the ladder up. And sometimes our employees in the farm, they didn't even know that we were hiding in that place. So it was time of hide and seek with the police, all the time under threat that we could be arrested. It was very frightening time. But as I said, Slovak people hated the Tiso regime, and so on the 29th of August 1944, there was an uprising in Slovakia. In other words, the Slovak nation rebelled against the Tiso regime. Many soldiers defected from the army, joined the rebellion. Many police defected the police force and joined the rebellion as well. So Slovakia had no power to suppress this uprising, and therefore for the first time the German army occupied Slovakia. Not because they wanted to occupy Slovakia, but because they wanted to save the Tiso regime, which they of course did. But the resistance continued, the uprising was suppressed, and of course immediately afterwards also a unit of Adolf Eichmann arrived to Slovakia. It was the Gestapo, the German secret service. And we knew that once the German secret service will join with the Hlinka Guard, they will become very efficient. They will put spies in the villages and towns, and slowly the Jews still that were left in Slovakia, around 25 to 30,000, they will be arrested. We knew that the documents we had for exemption, they won't count anymore because the Germans were in charge, and therefore we realized if we stay in the village, sooner or later somebody will betray us, because we didn't know who was our friend, who was our enemy, and we decided to leave the village. But of course with a name like Reichenthal, with a name like Reichenthal, we wouldn't have gone too far. Or we were German, or we were Jews. Of course, if we were not German, they would have no right away that we were Jews. So we couldn't sort of go out and take a train, because in the train station and all the official places, there was police, there was the Gestapo, everybody had to identify himself. So we needed false paper with a Slovak name. As it happened, my parents were very friendly with the local priest. His name was Ladislav Harangozov. He was a good priest. He did not preach hatred of Jews in the church. He preached Christianity. My parents were very friendly. They used to socialize with him. They used to go a couple of times a week and play cards with him, having a social drink. And he suggested once or twice before to my mother, he said, you know, it's very difficult to be Jewish. Why don't you convert? I will make the conversion. But my mother didn't pick up this suggestion, because the law in Slovakia was that in order that conversion is recognized, you had to be converted before 1922. So it wouldn't have helped us anyway. But this time, my mother said to Father Harangozov, you know, you wanted to help us. We need false paper with a Slovak name. Can you get us false paper? We have to leave the village, because sooner or later somebody will betray us. And he said yes, he will. And within a couple of days, he obtained false paper for us. And the name was Vida. Now I remember it very well, because at the time when we got this new paper with the name Vida, my parents began to drill into my head, you know, if anybody asks what is your name, you have to say your name is Thomas Vida, not Thomas Reichenthal. If you say Reichenthal, we will be betrayed and terrible thing could happen to us. Vida was a typical Slovak name, like in Ireland you would have Murphy or Connor. It's a typical Irish name. I can guarantee you there is no Jewish people in Ireland that are called Murphy or Connor. So Vida was a typical Slovak name. And we got the paper. The priest also said, you know, if you move into a new village, your children will have to go to the national school, because we couldn't just roam the village and not going to school. And if we go to school and we don't know anything about the Roman Catholic religion, the children will very quickly discover that we were not Roman Catholics. So he suggested before we leave, we go to him every day and he will teach us some things about the faith. We left about September, so about 2 or 3 weeks. Every day we went to Father Harangozov. He taught us the prayers that the children pray before the day starts. He taught us about the various holy days in the Christian calendar. He taught us about the Station of the Cross. He taught us how to cross ourselves, how to make a grace. All these little things that we know something, that we were not totally ignorant. It was middle to the end of September that we left the village. It was my mother, my brother and myself. My father stayed behind. and we went to Bratislava, where we were supposed to pick up my grandmother. My father stayed behind because he had to look after the livestock, after the farm. He said, look, I will be able to look after myself. I have a lot of friends around and it will be all right. They will be helping me. We were only a couple of days in Bratislava when we heard, in fact, that my father was arrested. At the time, my mother thought, that's it. We will never see our father again. Because at the time already the adult among us knew about the gas chamber, about the crematoriums, about the mass execution of the Jews. And she thought, that's it, he will be gone and we will never see him. But after a couple of days, we received a postcard from my father. There were 4 words: I'm alive, don't worry. We didn't know at the time where it came from and what happened to him. But thankfully, we were reunited after the war, and he told us what happened. He went out like he always used to go with the dog. He would take his stick and go to see the field outside of the village to see that everything is growing without any disease. This time, he was on the road and a lorry was coming opposite him. He didn't realize who was in the lorry. He didn't try to jump into the ditch and hide or anything. He just continued to walk, but unfortunately it was a lorry of the Hlinka Guard. And one of the men in the lorry was a local man who was a captain in the Hlinka Guard. And when he saw my father, he shouted, "That's a Jew." They stopped the lorry, they picked him up, they didn't even allow him to go home. He was taken away. He was sent to detention camp Seret in Slovakia, from where already the transport of Jews again began into the extermination camp. And he was put into a cattle cart and taken away, most probably, to Auschwitz, where he would have perished. But in this cattle car there was a man that suddenly stood up. The train was going during the night, because this train always went during the night because they didn't want to show the population what they were doing to the Jews. He stood up and he said, I'm going to open this carriage, and anybody wants to save himself should jump after me. This man was a Hungarian man. He already escaped twice. He was a crook, he was a safecracker. And he put a saw blade into the handle of his suitcase. He proceeded to take the saw blade out, and he managed to cut a hole in the door. I don't know if you saw a cattle cart, the sliding door, and outside there's sort of a hook. They close it with the hook, so you can't really open it from inside. But once he cut the hole, he was able to open the carriage. He opened the door, jumped out, and my father jumped after him, and another man was beside him, jumped after my father. I discovered only several years ago that only 3 people jumped out of this train, because not everybody has the courage to jump from a fast-moving train into the darkness. These 3 men proceeded to go to the forest where the resistance army was, the partisans. They joined the partisans and fought against the Germans till end of the war. And so, thankfully, my father survived. We were in Bratislava. It was on the 16th of October 1944, when my mother went to collect her mother. She was waiting for her in a laundry shop. She left us, my brother and myself, about 200 yards from the shop. She said, I will collect my mother and we will all go together to the train station, to the new place. When my mother entered the shop, She saw many police inside the shop. She saw her mother. She was beaten up. Her face was all swollen, black from beating. She knew something terrible happened here. She saw many of her brother and sister also there in the shop. So she pretended she came to collect laundry. Immediately she had to identify herself. So she gave them the ID card. Was written Judith Vida. It was all right. But unfortunately, the priest did not change her maiden name. Her maiden name was Shaimovic. Shaimovic was sort of a Hungarian Slovak name. He thought he doesn't need to change it. So unfortunately, the old lady that they were beating up, she was Rosalia Shaimovic, my mother's mother. They immediately knew the connection, and my mother was arrested. When they opened the cases, they found children's clothes. They said to my mother, "Where are your children?" My mother knew if she tried to deny or some excuses, they would beat her up, and eventually she will have to tell them anyway, because the Gestapo, they were law to themselves. If they needed information, it didn't matter what they did, they could kill somebody. It's not like today, if a policeman does something, they have to fill up a whole record and exactly what happened and how it's happened. At the time, the Gestapo could kill anybody. They didn't need to find any excuses. They could do what they want. So my mother told them where we were, and the next thing, these two men entered the shop. I just want to mention that what this priest did, that he provided us with false paper, that he taught us about Catholic religion. If he was caught at the time that he provided paper to Jewish people, that he taught Jewish children, he would have been taken out of the church, put to the wall. There wouldn't have been any trial or anything. He would have been put to the wall and he would have been shot. So what he did for us at the time, it was very, very heroic. I visited Slovakia many times since after the war, of course. And I was there many years ago. I went to the village and I went to the graveyard. Father Harangozo died in 1976. I went to his grave and I paid my respect for what he did for us, even though, unfortunately, in the end, he didn't save us. But this was an exceptional thing, what he did. These two men, as I said, entered the shop. We knew right away they were the Gestapo, because they wore the Gestapo uniform. It was a long leather coat, swastika on the left arm, hat, polished boots. They used to wear blonde, tall. They came straight to my brother and said, "You're Jewish?" And my brother said, "I'm not Jewish. My name is Miklos Vida. I'm not Jewish. But we know you're Jewish." We, of course, didn't know that he knew. And he asked several times, and my brother still was denying that he was Jewish. And the next thing, they started to beat him up. My brother was at the time nearly 13-year-old. He was quite tall for his age. He was still denying. And then they turned around to me. I was small and quite skinny. They looked at me and said, "But you're Jewish." And I said, "No, I'm not Jewish. My name is Thomas Vida." With a name like Vida, we thought nobody will suspect that we were Jewish. He asked me 2 or 3 times. I still was denying, and the next thing, I was beaten up as well. My brother was always very protective of me. I was at the time 9-year-old, but still quite weak sort of. He was very protective, and he suddenly jumped out and said, "Please, please, don't beat my brother. We are Jewish." And we were taken to the shop, and there we saw all the family, there were 13 of us arrested on that day. As I said, when the Gestapo needed to find information, they knew how to do it, and from one person to the next, they found out. Unfortunately, my grandmother was betrayed. They beat her up. She was an old lady, at the time 76-year-old. At the time 76 was a very old age. Today we still think it's quite young. And they beat her up, and she gave the name of her daughter and son, my uncle and aunties. They were all arrested. So all together on that day, 13 of us were arrested. We were taken to the Gestapo headquarters in Bratislava, and from there the next day we were taken to the detention camp Seret. In Seret they did the selection. I don't know if you heard the word selection, but in the Jewish vocabulary it's a very frightening word, because in this selection families were being split. It's all happened within seconds. The young men and women would go to the right, married children and old people to the left. In other words, this group to live, this group to die. The man that did the selection in Seret, his name was Alois Brunner. He was a brutal man. He played a god. He decided who is going to live and who is going to die. It was on the 2nd of November that we were called to a roll call to come in front of Alois Brunner. There were about 250 of us. Family by family would come in front of him. He would put young men and women to one side, married children and old people to the left. So our group was split. 7 went to the right, and 6 of us, my grandmother, my aunt, one of my cousins, my mother, my brother and myself, to the left. The adult among us, they already knew what that meant. So can you imagine the feeling of our group? They thought, that's it, we were sentenced to death practically. But as it happened, the 7 people on the right side, and I remember when we said goodbye to them, I saw my aunt saying goodbye to her husband. She didn't even have time to kiss him or anything. And we just waved goodbye. They went to the right, we went to the left. The group that went to the right went to Buchenwald and Sachsenhausen. Buchenwald was a slave labor camp. The inmates worked in stone quarries. They worked 12 hours a day with very little food, in the cold outside, with disease. So many of them died. Their life expectancy was between 2 to 3 months. So unfortunately, out of the group of 7, only 1 person survived. It was my cousin. He was 15-year-old. The rest of them perished in the Holocaust. So in fact, when we waved our goodbye to them, it was for the last time. We never saw them again. We were put into a cattle car. There was straw on the floor. In the middle there was a big barrel with open buckets that served as toilet. Once the door closed behind us, our civilized life ended. And I can't tell you what it is when you, from one moment, you find yourself in this situation. There was no privacy, there was no hygiene. We were traveling like this for 7 days. The stench became unbearable in the place. People were crying. One woman actually died in our carriage, and I remember for the first time I saw a dead person lying in front of me. Can you imagine for a child of 9-year-old to seeing a dead person lying for days in front of him? Occasionally the train would stop on a sideline, they would open the door, they would empty the barrel, they would give us some water, some food, and we would continue. There were no windows, so we never knew where we are, where we travel. There were only sort of air holes, little square. I don't know if you, as I said, I don't know if you saw a cattle cart. It's not very big. There were about 50 of us. We were squeezed in very small place. Wherever we stood or wherever we sat, we were being that crunch like this for 7 days, all the time in the same position. The conditions were just dreadful, and it's very difficult to describe, to find when you living a civilized life, a comfortable life, and suddenly from 1 minute to the next minute you find yourself in this type of situation. It was on the 9th of November 1944 when the door suddenly opened. It was middle of the night, it was raining, in the darkness we were pushed out of the carriage, schnell, heraus, quickly out. There were SS guards on the platform with weapon, with Alsatian dog, and they were just pushing us out, quickly out, and being put into rows. It was raining, the searchlight was lighting into our eyes, so we couldn't see anything around us. And just as my brother was coming out, this SS man grabbed him up and he said, "Go there and help this woman with the corpse." And he suddenly was split from us, so we were very, very frightened. We were shouting his name, Miklos, Miklos, in the darkness, because we didn't want to be separated. We were put into row and taken into the march. Eventually, my brother joined us. We were marching like this for about 2.5 hours until we saw in the horizon this chimney with glow coming out of the chimney. Can you imagine at the time, the adult among us, again, I wouldn't have known anything about these things, I wasn't taught, but they knew already what crematoria is, what gas chamber is. These people thought, that's where we are going. This is perhaps the last couple of minutes, an hour, that we are walking on this earth. Can you imagine the feeling, the atmosphere among the adults among us when they saw this chimney with this fire coming out of it? But we were taken to a large gate. There were a lot of huts in front of us, watchtower on each side with German soldiers, with machine guns, and Alsatian dog accompanying us into the barracks, and we were told to go to sleep. We went in, there were bunk beds, 3 beds, one over another. We took 2 of these beds and we just fell onto the bed. We didn't even take the clothes off or shoes or anything. We were absolutely soaked through from the rain. We didn't have any protective clothing, but we were so exhausted. After all this travel, we were crunched in one place. This was for the first time that we could actually stretch ourselves on a bed, so we just fell asleep. It took 2 or 3 minutes, we thought, and the next thing, we hear again shouting, "Heraus, heraus, Avzelapi." We didn't even realize that we slept. It just felt like a couple of minutes. And we had to go to a roll call. At this roll call, we were told for the first time that we were in Bergen-Belsen. We didn't know what Bergen-Belsen was, where Bergen-Belsen was. But we found out, this time we found out that Bergen-Belsen was built in 1939, first to hold Belgian and French prisoners of war, later Polish and Russian prisoners of war. These soldiers had to build the camp from scratch. It was in the middle of a forest. They had no roof over their head. They had to build this camp from nothing. So many of them died, especially in the winter. It is estimated that within 1 year, 20,000 soldiers perished building Bergen-Belsen. In 1943, the German authority decided to convert the camp to a detention camp mostly for Jews, but also for other prisoners, Jehovah's Witnesses, gypsies, of course soldiers, Polish and Russian soldiers, German political prisoners, gay and lesbian. The camp was divided in several parts. When we arrived to Bergen-Belsen, this was hell on earth. It was, of course, in November 1944, already